While most presidents wore suit jackets, ties, and dress pants all the time, you don't have to any longer. Because Presidents Unplugged has merch. If you want to check out some new shirts to buy as a nice gift for somebody in your family or just something that you want yourself, go to presidentsunpluggedmerch.com to check out new shirts, hoodies, crew necks, and anything else that you can dream of. Now in many more colors and new designs coming soon. I'm very excited for the President's Unplugged merch store to finally be open. Now, let's get back to the show. I like Ike, but do you like Ike? Who in the world is Ike, and why are we even talking about him? And why is Ike Dwight D. Eisenhower one of the most important military generals in United States history? Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Presidents Unplugged. And today we're talking about a pretty important man in American history. One that was a lowly military assistant 1 year, and then, in less than 3 years' time, was the leader of the entire military in the United States and Europe. Let's talk about it on this episode of Presidents Unplugged. Let's do this. Born on October 14th, 1890, Dwight David Eisenhower and his 6 brothers were born into an extremely religious family. Eisenhower's mother and father constantly pushed learning more about your faith to Eisenhower and his 6 brothers. Now, even though the dad pushed a little bit harder than the mom did on the religious aspect, the dad was not a very good role model. He was extremely aggressive and volatile in everything he did. And those traits made Eisenhower really lean towards his mom a lot of the time instead of his dad. And Eisenhower would later state that his mother was one of the biggest inspirations to who he would one day become. Eisenhower loved to play sports, just like Donald Trump. He played a ton of sports all the time. He was extremely athletic in school, but he broke his knee in high school. And as a guy who broke his knee literally the year before high school, yeah, it's not fun. It deters you from ever wanting to do sports again. But Eisenhower, just like we'll learn in the future, had an extreme drive. Now, this time in high school athletics, right before West Point, Eisenhower gained a nickname that I'm going to call him pretty much interchangeably for the rest of this episode. Ike. Ike, somehow, is an abbreviation of Eisenhower. How that works, I don't know, but it supposedly is. So, Ike became the nickname for Eisenhower for the rest of his life. From his high school football team to his political campaigns, Ike would become what a lot of people knew Dwight D. Eisenhower as. So, when you hear the name Ike over the next 15 minutes on Presidents Unplugged, know that I'm talking about Mr. Eisenhower himself. As we've learned in other episodes, West Point is a military school. You go there to not only pursue an education, but to learn to one day fight in the military, possibly. Eisenhower had friends on his high school football team who were going to the Navy, who pushed him, said, "Oh, Eisenhower, you should go to West Point," because they told him he wouldn't have to pay tuition, which is a big thing back then, because Eisenhower's family wasn't extremely wealthy. Eisenhower not only saw this as a chance for cheaper education, but he also saw it as a chance to travel the world. Eisenhower was from Kansas. "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore," is what they said in The Wizard of Oz. But Dwight Eisenhower didn't want to be in Kansas anymore. He wanted to travel the world. He wanted to see places, and the military was a perfect way to do that. But Eisenhower's mom, being a Jehovah's Witness, was a little bit against fighting. kind of a pacifist group overall. And Eisenhower's mom being such a big example in his life, it was difficult for Eisenhower to say, I want to go to a military academy where we learn how to fight, when his mom was strictly pacifist in that regard. But eventually, Eisenhower's mom, even though in the moment not liking it, knew it was probably best for her son and let him go in the end. Eisenhower thrived at West Point. He entered West Point in 1910, knee fully intact, ready to tackle the world. Oh my gosh, he's already injured it again. Yeah. Right when he got into West Point, playing football, he injured his knee again, which ended his football career forever. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Breaking your knee twice. I know, that's discouraging. You don't want to ever do anything like that again, because it's like traumatizing. But Eisenhower had a passion for football, and he wanted to teach other people his skills that he knew. Being a mentor. Eisenhower came back to football at West Point and coached the younger kids. Coaching people off of the skills that you know to be better themselves. That sounds like something a general would do. This time, as a football coach at West Point, in my opinion, took Eisenhower and showed him that it's cool to teach the people around you what you know to make them better. This little drive to coach this football team really pushed Eisenhower to, in the future, be a super influential military general. He coached football all the way through West Point until he graduated in 1915. And 1915 is also a pretty important year for Eisenhower for another reason. In 1915, he met his future wife, Mary Mammy Dowd. Mammy Eisenhower is the nickname that a lot of people have given her. But I can't say Mammy without some lisp or me breaking up the word. So on this episode, we're going to say Mary Eisenhower, okay? We got that? Speaking of Mary, he did. In July of 1916, in the heat of World War I, Eisenhower marries Mary Dowd, and she becomes Mary Eisenhower. Oh, how sweet. And not too long after that, they had their first child named Dowd Eisenhower, or as they nicknamed him, Little Icky. But sadly, he died at the age of 3 from an uncurable disease at that time, scarlet fever. This deterred Eisenhower and Mary. They didn't know what to do. But Eisenhower's time in the military and his position allowed them to have an opportunity of a lifetime to travel the world. Eisenhower didn't just travel for fun. He had to serve around the world, depending on what he had to do. He lived in Panama for a time. He lived in France for a time. He lived in the Philippines for a time. He lived in England for a time. And he lived in Algeria for a time. Yeah, that's Algeria, Africa, by the way. In World War I, the time when he was traveling around the world, he never saw combat, particularly. And around this time, Eisenhower met a man by the name of General Fox Connor. Now, in the grand scheme of Eisenhower's story, Fox Connor's really important. He was basically Eisenhower's mentor for his entire time in between World War I and World War II. Fox Connor saw a general in Eisenhower from the beginning, and he really prepared him for a high command that he would one day probably have in the future, and he urged Eisenhower to go into more schooling to learn more and more about the military and how to one day be the best possible general he could be. And Eisenhower did just that. He went to 3 separate schools to learn more and more about the military. That's a lot of school, y'all. And after that, Eisenhower actually wrote a book about World War I strategies. Eisenhower was a mastermind in war technique. This war technique that he had learned over not only his education but his mentorship from the great General Fox Connor, he'd have to use that very soon. Eisenhower's first real position in the military was being Douglas MacArthur's chief aide. And a quick rundown of who Douglas MacArthur is. A big war hero in American history. Being under Douglas MacArthur was no joke. And Eisenhower really did learn a ton from Douglas MacArthur being his chief aide. Because MacArthur was a 5-star general. Wow, that's a crazy title. But here's a cool fact. MacArthur could have never guessed that that little guy who was helping him a couple years ago would, in less than 15 years' time, be a 5-star general just like he is. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. See you there. After Eisenhower took a little trip in the 1930s, Douglas MacArthur decided, I'm going to put somebody else in your position. So he did. Douglas MacArthur replaced Eisenhower, honestly just cut him off while he was gone on vacation. And even though this trip wasn't malicious towards really anybody, Eisenhower was just taking a vacation, MacArthur took it as, he's slacking, and I'm going to put somebody else in his position. And this one decision from MacArthur would make him and Eisenhower butt heads for the rest of their lives. But little did MacArthur know that him overshadowing Eisenhower in his position would be one of the best things that would ever happen to him. Because from there on out, Eisenhower continued his consistent upbringing to a 5-star military general, a title that only 9 men in history, including Douglas MacArthur, have to their name. Now, as we get into this section of the video, I want to quote another episode of Presidents Unplugged, Reconstruction and Resolve, the Ulysses Grant episode. This is Presidents Unplugged, not Battles Unplugged, and I could go on for hours about all of Dwight Eisenhower's many invasions, attacks, plans from World War II. That'd be really cool. But this is Presidents Unplugged. We're almost 12 minutes through, and I haven't even gotten to his presidency yet. But remember, on these little episodes about the presidents, on Presidents Unplugged, what brings them to the presidency is just as important to me as the presidency itself. So let's quickly end World War II real quick. Okay, so Eisenhower commanded the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. They stormed the beaches of Normandy. We've heard this story 1,000 times. The United States, it was very successful. And long story short, this one mission that Eisenhower pretty much set up led to our eventual victory in Europe, on May 8th, 1945. And, America had to fight in the Pacific, and we eventually bombed Japan. Eisenhower didn't agree with the bombings in Japan, by the way. And then we won the war. Eisenhower made some extremely important war decisions, and the American people knew it for a fact. After he came back from World War II, he was known as the war hero. In parades, he waved as the people cheered, "Eisenhower, Eisenhower, he should be our president." Ooh, that would be fun. In 1952, Eisenhower ran to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. Eisenhower really didn't have a party affiliation until this point, but he eventually sided with the Republicans. Here's something interesting. Ike, that cool name I've been talking about this whole time. For the first time in history, a presidential campaign slogan was broadcasted on TV. And if your grandma was alive then, she probably remembers, "I like Ike, I like Ike, I like Ike." Those three words were broadcasted all over the states to promote this amazing presidential candidate of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he beat Adlai Stevenson by a pretty good margin. And after winning this big election, Eisenhower did multiple things that were very important. The four that I'm going to mention today are some of my favorites. Have you ever been driving on the highway? You're in the car on the highway, and you say, "Why is this here?" Thank Dwight Eisenhower. During his presidency, Eisenhower realized how important it was to have distinct highways to link states and major cities together. Eisenhower wanted to make a specific road so you don't have to drive through dirt roads in Arizona to make it from one side of the country to the other. And the highway system is something that we take for granted today. So thank Eisenhower for that. Second off, Eisenhower kind of ended the Korean War. Harry Truman, in 1950, entered the United States into the Korean War to stop communism. And all the Americans thought, "Oh, I know how we can end this war. Nuclear weapons." But Eisenhower said, "Nah, man, that's not necessary." Nuclear weapons were on Americans' minds after Harry Truman bombed Japan not once, but twice. But Eisenhower thought that he could still use the idea of nuclear weapons to possibly win this war. Eisenhower ended the Korean War through threatening Korea, putting pressure on them, saying, "We will send nuclear weapons your way if you don't give up." This scared North Korea, who was actively trying to put communism on South Korea, to stop. They set up an armistice agreement, and in the end, nobody had to get nuked. High fives all around. A win is a win. And the Korean War was over. And the last thing I want to talk about in the Eisenhower episode today is the space race. Eisenhower saw Russia send a little tiny satellite called Sputnik, the first ever real satellite to reach past our atmosphere. So very soon after the Russians, aka we oppose communism in this country, we launched something called NASA. Now, even though in the beginning NASA was just creating satellites and stuff, just a heads up, NASA did some very, very important things in our history. We put a man on the moon, we put people in space, a lot of people in space. NASA has done some incredible things for our country, and even though we didn't send a man to the moon, for example, until Richard Nixon's presidency, who was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, by the way, Eisenhower did kickstart the whole program, and the space race is one of the most important things that people talk about in the late 50s and early 60s, and Eisenhower started the fire. With all that success in Eisenhower's 8 years in the presidency, he said one very important thing that I want to mention in his farewell address. Eisenhower mentioned something called the military-industrial complex. And because we're approaching a little bit longer than 15 minutes, I'm going to shorten it down for you. The military-industrial complex was an idea that Eisenhower was really close to. He witnessed tons of weapons, tons of bullets, tons of tanks built throughout his life. And him being in politics and the military, he knew that companies making all these weapons, making billions and billions of dollars, would actually profit off of war. And it made some people actually want war to continue. Okay, everyone's making money. Then why would we stop? War is not a good thing. Even if in certain instances it can profit and make companies more affluent, war is not a good thing. And we should not value and continue war for the value of the dollars in your pocket. Eisenhower really just wanted to share the message that, yes, even though we were making money and all this great stuff for our country, constantly in war, in the end, we need to step up as a nation and do the right thing, because war is not right. Eisenhower is one of the most important men in United States history. He had a title that only 9 others have ever achieved, also was our president, and did so much to build the country up while never letting us down. And that is why Dwight David Ike Eisenhower is so important. But now, we have an outro to be getting to. Tune in next Friday on a very special episode of Presidents Unplugged. For the first time in the show's history, I'm not just going to be talking about one president's life, one election, one event in history. I'm going to have a Presidents Unplugged Q&A, special extravaganza, whatever other adjective you want to put on top. A very important episode, where I will not just be talking about things that I wrote on a piece of paper to talk about. I will be talking about the questions that you, the Presidents Unplugged community, have sent to me personally. Now, oh my gosh, I want my question to be featured on the show. Well, you can when you DM me at Presidents_Unplugged on Instagram to possibly have your question featured on next week's episode. Get ready, Friday, August 29th at 1 p.m. I'm so excited to see you there. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow Presidents Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.